Good evening. Thank you all for being here. Welcome to the New York City Bar Association's Zoom meeting hall. We are gathered here to talk about migrants in New York, their dignity in healthcare and housing. This event will focus on providing an update on the city's response to the migrant busing crisis. It will provide information pertaining to challenges that the migrants are presently facing to their rights, housing, employment, and receipt of benefits. It will explore and question the narrative that migrants are taking away resources from low-income New Yorkers. Legislative experts and on-the-ground advocates will discuss the current state of migrants' rights in New York City and what challenges are to come. I'm Catherine Frizzell, Chair of the Migrants' Rights Subcommittee, the Social Welfare Committee of the New York City Bar Association. I want to start by thanking the co-chairs of the Social Welfare Committee, Lindsay Funk and Sandra Gressel. I would also like to thank our co-sponsoring committees and their respective chairs, especially the New York City Affairs Committee and its chair, Jeremy Fagelson. We also thank the Immigration and Nationality Law Committee and its chair, Danny Alessia, the Housing and Urban Development Committee and its co-chairs, Rachel Jaffe and Carol Robinson, and the Health Law Committee and its chair, Heather Hatcher. Thank you also to Martha Harris and the entire New York City Bar Association team for making this discussion tonight possible. My role tonight is to hand the discussion over to the moderator, Jeffrey C. Mays, to lead the discussion. Before I do that, we just have a couple of reminders. First, we are so very thankful to have all the speakers generously donate their time and knowledge to this discussion tonight. As a reminder, none of the speakers are official spokespeople for their employers, including those speakers who work for city and state government. Second, this event is organized by the City Bar as a webinar, meaning that the speakers cannot see the audience. So please use the Q&A function in Zoom if you have any questions. Please do not use the chat function. It is disabled for the audience. With those reminders being said, I'm delighted to introduce our moderator for tonight. Jeffrey C. Mays is a politics reporter on the Metro desk of the New York Times. Jeffrey covers politics with a focus on City Hall. A native of Brooklyn, he's a graduate of Columbia University. Jeffrey has been covering the migrant crisis as it evolves. We are especially excited to have Jeffrey moderate the webinar tonight because of his coverage of the topics we will be discussing. One of his latest articles, published on May 18, 2023, co-written with Liam Stack, is entitled, "As Crisis Grows, All of New York's Migrant Plans Are Met with Outrage." Thank you again, Jeffrey, for moderating this panel. With that, I turn it over to you for the remainder of the introductions and to lead the conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me to talk about this important topic. More importantly, I want to thank these powerhouse panelists we have who just have such deep knowledge and insight about this issue. Why don't we just start off with everyone introducing themselves, and I'm hoping maybe we can start with Deputy Mayor Williams-Isom, who can introduce herself.
Yes, hi, everyone calls me Deputy Mayor Ann. I'm Deputy Mayor Ann. I am the Deputy Mayor for Health and Human Services and oversee that whole portfolio, which includes the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, the Department of Health and Human Services, and H&H, some of the city agencies that have been overseeing this humanitarian crisis from the very beginning.
Thank you. We have Reverend Juan Carlos Ruiz. Maybe you can introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. Juan Carlos Ruiz. I am the pastor of Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. We've been engaged and actively involved in welcoming this recent wave of immigrants. But we've been working for many years via the sanctuary movement at the national level and at the local level with the sanctuary coalitions and networks throughout the 5 boroughs. So I am glad to be here with all of you.
Thank you. We also have joining us Stephanie Cordero.
Yes, hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be here to speak about these important issues. I'm Stephanie Cordero. I'm the director of the Immigration Unit at Brooklyn Legal Services, which is part of Legal Services New York City. And I direct our Immigration Unit, which focuses on removal defense and affirmative applications that we've been serving as much as we can the recent arrivals, both in individual representation as well as in pro se applications and other brief services. Thank you.
Thank you. We also have Guillermo Martinez joining us as well. Guillermo.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks to the New York City Bar and Catherine Frizzle for organizing this important event and discussion. I'm the Deputy Director of the Institute on Immigrant Integration, Research and Policy at the State University of New York under the Rockefeller Institute of Government. The Institute is entrusted with collecting best practices and policy solutions on immigrant integration, which is how to narrow the gap between foreign-born and native-born in social, economic, and civic status, and presenting that to policymakers across the state so they can enact on solid policy.
Great, thank you so much. Finally, last but not least, we have Harold Solis. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Yeah, my name is Harold Solis. I am one of the co-legal directors here at Make the Road New York. We are a community-based and community-led organization that focuses on the various needs of working class and immigrant communities across the city and across New York State. Very relevant to this conversation today is that we've been at the forefront really of doing what we can to help welcome and resettle many of the new migrants that have been relocated to New York City. And we've been doing that through a range of various interventions and services, including our legal services, which has a deep and robust immigration program that helps people in removal proceedings and in their immigration proceedings as well.
Thank you. Well, let's just jump right into it. I know the Deputy Mayor has a limited time with us. So I just wanted to start off with you. You know, I've been to your many briefings and you've always been there with the mayor dealing with this situation. I'm wondering if maybe you can start us off by just telling us about the scope of what's happening now. You know, what are the latest numbers? You know, how many asylum seekers and migrants have actually arrived in the city? And maybe talk a little bit about the funding as well. I know you've seen this $4 billion number around a number of times, but maybe you can talk to us a little bit about the overall.
I would be happy to. I know the people on this panel with me spend so much time doing this work, but I know that average New Yorkers may not really understand the scope of this and what has happened over these past, I guess it's been almost over a year from the time that we got the first migrants coming to us. So I really can't overemphasize how insignificant this issue is for the city right now, the state, and actually the country. And as I mentioned in my briefing earlier today, we now in New York City are caring for over 100,000 people. And the majority of those people are folks that have come to New York City seeking asylum. So we have a little over 49,000 people who are our longtime unhoused New Yorkers and over 50,000 asylum seekers that we are caring for right now. Since the spring of last year, we've had over 80,000 asylum seekers that have come through our intake system here in New York City. Jeff, you asked me about costs. The city has spent already in excess of $1 billion in this humanitarian crisis, and we are anticipating that it's going to be up to $4 billion at a period of time, with only getting about $140 million in reimbursements from the city, from the federal government so far. We have, in terms of the services and the things that we have tried in this comprehensive strategy, I've said to people that when we first started this, we were thinking it would just be a couple of thousand people. And so our plan was X, Y, and Z. And then we had to move to plan B when it kept on being more. This past week, we had 2,500 migrants that showed up at our Roosevelt Intake Center. So while people think that it's slowing down, the numbers are still about 400 a day, people that are showing up in our center. And I'm sure that there are probably other migrants coming to New York City or other parts that maybe don't come to our Roosevelt Intake Center. We have sent about 1,000 folks upstate, as we have really been challenged to find spaces here in New York City. Thus far, we have had, I think we're up to 176 hotels and emergency sites that we've opened for our brothers and sisters that are coming here, 11 large humanitarian relief centers that we've had, and several emergency sites, because at times we don't have beds for people and folks have to stay in kind of a holding pattern in a place so that we make sure that until we have a bed that's available for them. The governor has joined in us in calling for the federal government for work authorization. So that has been helpful in the advocacy, but as you know, we haven't had any relief in that area yet. Last week, we announced an asylum seeker application help center where we have trained navigators and group of private sector partners to not give people legal services, but at least to help people on the path of beginning to start to do their applications, because while we know that there's many community-based organizations and legal organizations who are doing that, we think that we might be well suited because of the scope of the people that we have with us to start them getting on that path. We already know, and I've said this, there are the majority of folks that are in our care are families with children. That sometimes fluctuates, and sometimes we see more single men coming in. And all of our families and children are in hotels, and some of the single men that are coming in are in our congregate sites. Today, we announced 10 more contracts or extension of contracts of what we're calling our resource navigation centers that are all throughout the 5 boroughs, because we know that our asylum seekers and migrants find themselves throughout many different communities. And so opening a place where they can go and get support and figure out how to navigate New York City. And we know that that's very difficult for all of them. We've started a faith-based initiative, because we really do, I see the pastors that are here today, feel that the faith-based community can play a significant role, and we are gonna have to start to rely on them even more as we find ourselves not able to meet our obligation in terms of opening enough spaces for folks. So I'll end there, Jeff, by saying, we know that this is a national crisis, and what we're seeing is that no city is suited to deal with a national crisis by themselves. I mean, as good as we think we are here in New York City, I don't think that we're going to be able to do this by ourselves. We need more financial support. We need a national decompression strategy. We need work authorization for our asylum seekers, and clearly we need a comprehensive immigration reform.
Thank you for that. I'm wondering just if you could help set the stage a little more. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the challenges that the city is facing in housing and feeding that many people.
I mean, I can't, people say to me, even if we had more money, we certainly don't have enough money, because we are footing the bill for this right now. And we see that as we're going into this budget process that we're in right now. How do we make sure that we have all of the funds that we need for all New Yorkers are here? We have a staffing crisis that we've already had by being before COVID, and certainly after COVID, in our community-based organizations and here at the city too. So the staffing folks are working 12 hours a day in order to do what they need to do. We have a full health care and screening that we do for people, because we know that when they come here, they need to get immunized. They need to make sure that they don't have anything that they're any diseases that they might have right now that they need to be isolated for. We are providing mental health services, because the very nature of the journey that many have made and the uncertainty requires mental health support. And we don't have enough support for all the mental health support that we know that we need. We know that people are depressed. We are doing a screening at our navigation center. We've put about $60 million into the legal services in our Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs and in this new process that we have for helping people get connected to applications, and then also the money that we have given. I think there's about $5 million to the providers who've been working us for years. So I tell Jeff, you know, I didn't come to government and thinking that we were going to be dealing with this at this time, but it is about the shelter and a system that was overwhelmed from the time that we got here. I keep on saying that I don't think that this is a homelessness issue. This is an immigration issue, and it's being borne on the backs of a homeless system that's not really capable of really integrating and absorbing double the capacity of people. I don't think ever in the history of New York City have we cared for over 100,000 people. So I think that's the way that I would describe the need. It is everything from food, from shelter, to healthcare, to medical support. And ultimately what we want is that people come here to start a new life. And we feel that if they're able to get work authorization and then settle in communities, some, yes, definitely here in New York City, but we think that some in other parts of the state and maybe even in other parts of the country where we can build community, we think that if the federal government could help us in that coordination, that this humanitarian crisis that we're seeing would be able to be dealt with much, much better, and that folks would really be able to get the high quality supports that they need and that they've come here for.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I appreciate that detailed response. I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit now about, you know, the path of the migrants. How are they arriving in New York City? You know, which countries in particular are they coming from? You know, I know the Reverend is dealing with people and the challenges they're facing. So maybe Harold and Reverend Ruiz could answer those questions for us. You know, some of where are the migrants coming from? What are the challenges they're facing that you're seeing? And, you know, kind of what's being done? What are you guys specifically doing to help the asylum seekers?
So that's a shifting landscape. At the beginning, we were seeing back in August, we were seeing like 90% of the people that were coming to our church were mostly from Venezuela. And then that began shifting by the end of the year of 2022. And we had more of a diversity and people coming from Ecuador, Colombia, Peru. So the population has been shifting. Now, the experience of being on the run, displaced, and going through the jungle in Panama for many of them has really scarred them. You know, a lot of the families that are coming are really in great despair, to say the least. A lot of, you know, I was, at the beginning, I was kind of confused because most of the people were looking, the most needed item that they were asking for were telephones or a way to communicate with their families who were making their way to the north, here to here, or just to get connected back home. Because on the journey towards the north, you know, many got disconnected, many got separated. So there was this great need of people really reconnecting with their loved ones. So that was one of the surprising needs for me as I was, you know, we were tending. We get to our church about 500 families or so per week, you know. Right now, we are, as I said, you know, at the beginning, it was Venezuela. Now we are seeing a lot, most of them who are coming out from Colombia. And people, once again, you know, who have a long history in their homeland of violence, insecurity. You know, I spent many years kind of as an organizer pointing out that, you know, our foreign policy as a nation had to be changed. And, you know, I always were kind of connecting the dots So I think we have, as a host country, as a host city, we have this privileged position that is fairly evident. You know, our policies abroad are really displacing and terrorizing entire communities, entire countries, and it's messing up with their self-determination. I think we need to correct that. I think this is a long shout for all of us to really pay attention and really, you know, make, not allow history to repeat itself over and over. Harold, you can add.
I'm happy to add a little bit more here because it's a really important question. We actually spent the last, few months conducting a survey, a first of its kind survey that, gave many of these individuals the opportunity to share, their experiences with us for the first time in a really coordinated effort that would, help us understand with data, right, where folks were coming from, what were some of the challenges that they were facing once they came here. And I think the data lines up with what the Reverend was sharing, right? This report that we released earlier this month showed that about 65% of the individuals that we're seeing these days are from Venezuela. Close to 15% are from Colombia, and other places include, the remaining folks are from places like Peru and other countries that have been facing some really deep and troubling political turmoil during the last decade. So places like Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras, right? Places that we've seen historically, force residents to flee for a number of reasons, whether it's politics or other, difficult living situations in their home countries. What's different about this moment, though, and I like to remind people, right, when we're talking about this moment, is that what's different is that in the past, New York City has always welcomed people. We've been and always will be, in all likelihood, a city of immigrants. What's different about this moment is that once these individuals made their way to the United States, and after they went through such an odyssey to make their, to actually set foot on United States soil, they were then subjected to a political tactic, which was to relocate them from places down south up to New York City, right? All as part of a political game, right? These are people who were fleeing for their lives, oftentimes crossing that Darien Gap that the Reverend talked about, with their children on their backs, witnessed death along the way, were subjected to all forms of violence, and once here, rather than receiving the help and assistance that they required, were instead taken as political pawns and sent up here. That's what we're seeing now. So I think it's really important that we keep that at the forefront whenever we're talking about this moment, because that's what makes it different. That's what needs to be at the center of any conversation when we're talking about the policy decisions that we should be making to help these people mitigate some of the harm that they've already gone through.
Thank you. Appreciate that. I also understand that maybe we're seeing more African immigrants as well from the continent. I've heard that. And I've also heard that, part of the problem is that, with the Venezuelan migrants, for example, they didn't necessarily have the same sort of network set up that Mexican asylum seekers had, for example. So I'm wondering, have you guys seen that? Have you seen the sort of difficulty in not having sort of already established networks, groups that are new coming to the country for the first time, and how has that affected the crisis, if you think it has?
We are next to Sunset Park, and the Muslim Community Center has been dealing with a great deal of Somalis, African Muslim immigrants. And this, there is this, the browning of immigration, we heard that term back in the days, and I think we need to really be aware, a lot of immigrants that come is not just, solely from the South. of this continent. It's the global South. And we are talking about people, moving massively from all parts of the world and on pilgrimage, on food, being displaced, being terrorized, and looking for shelter. I think we need to, uphold, it's right and center, this plight, as our friend here, Harold, said, of immigrants coming and given the political turmoil. But I think there is something also afoot in terms of this unprecedented crisis that we see here. And it's the not only complicity of subjecting people to being political pawns, but also a kind of a dormant policy by way of our federal government and not doing the right thing. I have a lot of undocumented parishioners, congregants from the church that are basically saying, and this is deceptively because it seems that, people are getting away with, by being vetted and paroled into the country, that they are being given a status, when in fact they are still very much airborne in limbo, in legal limbo. But it seems that it brings a message of division to the people that have been living in the shadows for the last 40 years or so. So now we have this new phenomenon, not only in the shelter system that historically has been really, mismanaged, so to speak, in New York City, but also we have, of populations being pitted ones against the other. And the added crisis that many people have lived in the shadows for the last 40 years and is still waiting for some kind of immigration reform or regularization of their status. So we are, I am fronting a lot of resentment by people that know me and basically are telling me, Father Juan Carlos, you have betrayed us. You have basically, given our back to us because you don't do enough for us. You are solely focusing on the arriving, immigrants. So we need, we have kind of an explosive phenomenon on our hands. There are people who have been silenced, who have been relegated to the shadows, who have been limited, and who have been living in some kind of limbo, legal limbo for many, many years. And that has to, there has to be something done at that level, at the federal level. And, we gotta stop the politicians, going back and forth, using people as pawns, less than, violating their humanity and making them less than human.
Jeffrey, if I could just say something about your question about immigrants from Africa, the Institute on Immigrant Integration Research and Policy, one of the first things we did when we started in late January was put together a fact sheet on some of that information. I'm just going to share really quick on the screen, if it's okay, and just to show the numbers, because you were talking about existing networks. So in New York, based on the last census, 205,677 New Yorkers were born in Africa. And the projections are that in the next 40 years, almost 10 million African immigrants will be making New York, the United States, their home. The fact sheet here, I can share with folks. I think if don't want to inundate the bar with requests for this fact sheet, but it's also posted on our website, and it has a lot of detail about employment breakdowns, English language competency, and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, since you are talking, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the center, the sort of purpose, and what kind of work you guys are doing, why it was created. Maybe you can go a little bit into that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, thank you. Through the leadership of Assemblywoman Catalina Cruz, who herself was an immigrant and a dreamer. She's a relatively new member to the legislature, but has been able to accomplish a great deal of work in a short time in New York State government. She was able to create and push the State University of New York to create a think tank, which is the Institute for Immigrant Integration Research and Policy. And the idea was there's a lot of research out there, there's a lot of knowledge out there, but it's not making it to policymakers at the state level, at the local level. And so the idea of the Institute is to gather all this knowledge and compile it and share it with policymakers so they can enact some of this legislation, some of the proposals for legislation and policy solutions, right? So so that's just a tip of the iceberg of where we're going. We're producing a bunch of information like these fact sheets. Some are in the pipeline, they're just waiting for approval, and then we'll be able to share them with folks. I'm going to share my screen one more time and show you one of the tools that the Institute's developing, which is this data gateway. So basically, it's ready to be launched. I suspect in a couple more weeks we'll be making it public. So any policymaker, any researcher, any practitioner could go into any county, scroll over it, and pull down specific data of immigrant integration variables in that county: unemployment rate, English language proficiency, occupation, poverty level. So this has never been done, and because it's very specific to New York, it's going to be a great policy tool. So in the short period that the Institute has been functioning, we've been able to accomplish a lot of work, and it's all going to be made public pretty soon. Again, the idea is to grab models that have worked in the United States and in the European Union on immigrant integration, models that have been proven to be successful, cost-effective, so we could fasten the pace of integration of immigrants in this country. And the reason that I bring this up, and just skipping through some of this, is that the Congressional Budget Office a few weeks ago put out a 30-year estimate, and this chart is I think has epic implications for policymakers. In 2042, the majority of the population growth in the United States will be just immigrant, because based on death rates in the United States, our birth rates will actually be in the negative. So we have less than really 20 years to use this example that's happening in New York City and throughout the country of this crisis to actually better the systems to improve immigrant integration, because this chart and this estimate is part of a bigger report that also showed the huge number of American natives who are going to be dependent on the social safety net, Social Security and Medicaid. And it's these workers, these immigrant workers, who are going to be feeding the money into the social safety net. And so we need to do a better job of integrating this new workforce. And we're less than a generation away from this epic shift in population growth for the country. So that's very important. But at the same time, we do witness a lot of pushback in today's newspapers. Siena College put out a poll. The results of their poll shows that 54% of New Yorkers disapprove of SUNY dorms being used as temporary housing for immigrants, and the majority disapprove of sending migrants upstate New York. So these are like real issues that have to be overcome in order for us to move ahead with some of the integration efforts, right? But at the same time, did you see this antagonism towards shipping, busing migrants up north of New York City? We know that for decades, New York State has accepted refugees by the tens of thousands. Buffalo, Syracuse, Rochester, and the city of Utica, between 1990 to today, have lost almost 30 to 50% of their native-born population. And if it wasn't for these refugees and immigrants settling in these cities, those cities would be devastated economically. Recent fact that I'd like to share with everybody is that in Utica, not in Utica, Rochester, Syracuse, and Buffalo, 40% of the refugees who have settled there are not homeowners. And that's a huge economic indicator, right? And an economic stimulus. So it shows the potential. So it's not that upstate New York, I think, is up in arms against more immigrants. I think perhaps it's just the face and the media, all the media attention on the border crisis, and then the images on TV, I think, create some stereotypes.
Well, thanks for that. Make sure you send me that link when this goes live. I would love to have that to dig into. That seems like really great information.
If I may say something also that I think I was forgetting, and I have to point out, we have a lot of Afro-Caribbeans, either from Colombia and from Venezuela. And I was looking at that because this is a very different population that has been coming to our city. A lot of the migrants are Black and indigenous. Spanish is not their first language for many of these indigenous populations, and their color of their skin is a lot, more darker. I mean, I have to say that, and I think that also, as Guillermo was pointing out, that affects how people respond, and evidences, the racism that we have is still very much in our systems, So I just wanted to point that out.
Thanks for adding that. I want to try to get Stephanie in here and also get the deputy mayor before she has to depart. We see the growth and the unprecedented numbers. I'm wondering, if maybe you could talk a little bit about the people that are arriving. What are the core needs that we're seeing? Is the city really able to meet a lot of those core needs? I know the city has focused a lot on housing and feeding people, but I know there are also other core needs. There was a story, I believe, about some harassment at one of the hotels. And so I'm wondering, are people being treated in a sort of dignified, safe manner? So maybe the deputy mayor and Stephanie can talk a little bit about that.
Stephanie, you want to go first?
It's up to you.
You go ahead.
I know you have to go.
I'm good. You go, because you haven't spoken yet.
Sure. From our perspective, I'm the director of a legal services organization, and particularly the immigration unit. So from our perspective, certainly the legal needs are not being met. As much funding as is going to the basic needs of the recent arrivals, which is very important. There's also the reality that there is a pending deportation proceeding hanging over them. And so while their needs are being met, their cases are actually going very quickly in immigration court. They are dedicated dockets for recent arrivals where their cases can be over in a matter of months, 6 months. Sometimes I've seen hearings where scheduled for individuals who are not represented be scheduled within 6 months. And so a whole case can be done in 6 months, and we might see a lot of folks with removal orders rather. So I certainly think, as Deputy Mayor Ann has explained, that there is some funding going to some legal needs, but not to the extent that it needs to be. And so we do need more funding. The legal services organizations need more funding to be able to help those with viable asylum claims, because that's what we've been seeing, is that the individuals that at least we see in Know Your Rights presentations, Brooklyn Legal Services has been through to churches, to shelters, to provide information about the immigration process. And what we're seeing is that most of these folks have viable claims that if they just had an attorney in court, they would likely succeed in their cases. And so I think that's a huge need that is not being met, and that absolutely the city needs more funding for, but I think is an important priority because as we've been mentioning, if these folks were given the opportunity to have a work permit, which could come out of filing for asylum, then maybe they can contribute more meaningful to the economy. They can maybe save up to pay for lawyers, and save up to pay for housing, which is really difficult in New York City. And so, yeah, certainly I think that there are a lot of needs that are not being met. And I just want to say something with regards to the housing situation. You know, we, in my organization, we have a housing practice, and I think that the migrant crisis is just exacerbating or highlighting the existing housing crisis that there is. Not only are migrants not able to, even if they saved or found a job, able to find an apartment, I think long-standing residents of New York aren't able to do so. And this is just highlighting that. And I'm not saying that New York City would have been prepared had they had a working housing system. But certainly it's a lot worse because there is no rent regulation, and rents are just, evictions are speeding up. They're happening quicker. And so I think that all of that adds to it. And so in a sense, I think we've done great work as a sanctuary city and providing shelter and the basic needs like food. But yeah, there's certainly a lot more that needs to be done.
I think you said that perfectly, because sometimes I get frustrated when I get this question, because I'm like, what do people need? They don't just need food and shelter. It's what all of us would need. They want security. They need to be safe. They want their kids to be in a good school. They want to have a great community. They want to have a life for themselves. I don't know about who has children, but could any of you imagine raising your children in a hotel room that doesn't really have a kitchen or a place for them to play or a place for them to do those things? I am proud of the response that the city has given. 81,000 people unexpected come into the city. I feel like I am proud of that, but I am also angry that the city is with, money is not limitless, and not giving people what they need and leaving this to just New York City to kind of figure out on their own. And Stephanie, I agree with you that there was a housing crisis that we inherited when we came into this administration. There were 45,000 people that were in the homeless system. And even if we're working on expediting exits and doing all those different things, we can't keep up with 400, 2,500 people coming in the front door. So yes, Jeff, for me, safety and care at its basic is what I'm asking of my staff and the community-based organizations, is to make sure people are safe, make sure people have what they want. But there is no way that we are meeting all the needs of these folks. And in some ways, we're doing a disservice by acting like patching these things together is really what they need and gives them the full dignity of what they came here for, in my opinion.
Harold, do you care to chime in on that?
Yeah, no, I think Stephanie named a lot of things that are really critical to keep in front of our minds, right? I mean, the housing crisis is definitely something that has predated this moment, and it's not something that the arrival of these new folks broke. It's been a problem for many years. We've been calling, from the moment that this started really receiving a lot of attention, very clearly calling for attention to the legal needs that a lot of these individuals are going to need, because we know what the trajectory tends to be for folks who are in these situations, right? We know that seeking asylum is an uphill battle. Asylum law, I know Stephanie, if we do this day in, day out, we know that seeking asylum, statistically speaking, is a hard thing, because most folks have a hard time actually seeing it through. Because they don't have legal representation to help them along the way, to help them navigate a very complicated system. And on top of that, we know that the substance of our asylum laws has grown more and more under-inclusive over the years, right? We saw this very particularly during the Trump administration, where there was a real concerted effort to undermine, access to asylum, and we continue to see it today to some degree under the Biden administration, right? So we know that's a problem, and we know that this is a multi-government level, problem. It requires assistance locally to ensure these people are set up as much as possible to mitigate some of the harm they've been through already. It means making sure they have access to representation so that they can actually understand the process that they're embarking on. And it means getting the federal government, right, to do what they need to do to rectify some of our longstanding problems with our immigration laws. And that includes improving access to asylum. That means improving, and modernizing the eligibility criteria for who should qualify for asylum, right? Like, we all got to remember that we're working with a statutory system that was born out of the 80s, and that's based on, an understanding of what it means to be a refugee from the mid 20th century. We're living in the 21st century now, when people are fleeing all sorts of things that were perhaps not fully contemplated back then, including things like climate change and displacement, right? And so there's a real need to think a little bit more about how we get our asylum laws to meet the challenges of today. And that obviously has a real federal government obligation on that end. The last thing I'll say on this, because I just got out of a different conversation talking about this, is TPS is a real short-term solution that could be used to really help this population. If we know statistically speaking that the majority of them are from places like Venezuela, the federal government could, right, through its regulatory powers, redesignate that country for TPS and open up essentially the window for new applicants. That would essentially cut back on a ton of the work that's going to go into helping folks apply for asylum, because TPS is a relatively easier process to go through, right? And it will help a lot of these folks get out of the immigration court process in all likelihood. So there are regulatory short-term solutions that could be explored. It's really a matter of acting on those solutions. Not doing anything is certainly not going to help the situation. These folks are not going anywhere. We know what happens when people who don't have a way of accessing our immigration system, getting on a path to some kind of status. We know what happens, right? People live here, people live in the shadows, they're exploited, they go through all sorts of challenges. And at the end of the day, they're still our neighbors, they're still our friends, and we have to see them struggling through all that.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
Jeffrey, can I say something real quick on this, the
Sure.
housing piece? Because it's not just New York City that's facing this housing crunch, right? So, for example, the federal government has allocated 125,000 refugee resettlement slots this year, and they start arriving in the United States from third countries in August. And cities like Buffalo and Rochester are basically at their limit because of the migrant crisis. And I'm not even sure how they're going to be able to do what they traditionally have done, provide housing for a group that's already been vetted and, it's coming in, and they're supposed to have resources in place to help them. So it's a problem for each corner of the state.
Thank you. Yeah, that just leading into that question, the deputy mayor, I see she's departed. The city has filed this lawsuit against upstate municipalities. I'm wondering if some of the panelists, or maybe Guillermo, can talk a little bit about, what the city's seeking. What are the responsibilities of New York State and other municipalities to help the city with the right to shelter requirements, for example. Maybe you can delve a little bit into that lawsuit, and anyone else can jump in too if they want to.
Yeah, I could just briefly speak to the lawsuit in terms of using the 14th Amendment as an avenue to challenge executive orders by some of these county executives. The state government was looking at possibility of the New York State Constitution, what it allows, what it doesn't allow. I think it's going to be a tough hurdle because two things. Health and safety rules and regulations aren't that easy to just be swept to the side at any time. And then number two, it's not like some of the folks arriving in New York City on their own, arriving in Binghamton. It's an organized effort to do this, right? So it changes the dynamic. But again, I'm not a lawyer, so I won't speak to that. But the idea that comes to mind is that, again, upstate has been welcoming for thousands of refugees and asylum seekers over the decades. And it's this current situation that is now creating this pushback that you have over 30 counties issuing executive orders to stop the busing of migrants from New York.
May I just want to weigh in on that lawsuit?
I was gonna say that there was a federal judge who did actually vacate the executive orders that some of these counties in Orange and Rockland counties have issued so that migrants don't come to those counties. So maybe there is actually a possibility that that can happen under the state laws as well. And I think it is an important move to make. I think that it's clear that regardless of what the purported purposes of the executive orders are, I think it's a pretty clear xenophobia phenomenon, or that they are issuing these orders due to racism. And speaking to how or if migrants are treated with dignity, I think that it's just very true that not only in the city's response, maybe they're not getting their needs met, but that is a reality that there is a lot of racism still underlying the policies that first the governor in Texas took, and then even in New York City, which we try to think of ourselves as a sanctuary city and are for in a lot of ways, but there are a lot of people in the state, and I think even in New York, who still take advantage and who still act on racist motives. I don't know if the next questions are about relief, but immigration relief, but I wanted to discuss some of that treatment in that light or in that context.
Yeah, absolutely. Why don't you go on and talk a little bit about that? Like what type of relief is available? How many of the asylum claims do you think are going to be successful? I know there's a timeline, there's a year timeline that you have to file that claim. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about that and some of the options available.
Yeah, and I think Harold started giving an overview of what the asylum process is like, and that it is very complicated. And so when I was speaking to the viability of the claims, I should qualify that by saying that they're viable if they have legal representation, if they have time to prepare their claims, if they have resources. And that's not going to be true. So I think by and large, we're going to see a lot of people with removal orders still living in the city, because I don't think that the federal government is going to have the resources to actually execute removal orders against everyone who will get them because they are not represented. And so you're just going to have a situation where we have a lot of people with removal orders unable to get work permits and who are still going to be here nonetheless. But there is a relief available, and if folks were given their due process right to pursue it meaningfully and have a fair hearing, asylum is certainly something that I think a lot of the migrants that I've seen at least would be eligible for and could have successful claims at. And Harold did mention that our laws are draconian, they're old, but there are still ways in which the migrants who are coming could qualify. And so asylum, just to give a little bit of an overview, is for those who are in the United States already, no matter how they entered, and who are afraid to return to their home countries because they have either suffered past persecution or are afraid that they will suffer future persecution. And the reason for the persecution has to be either the race, which we are seeing a lot of with Indigenous and Black migrants, religion, nationality. We see a lot of, say, Venezuelans who have lived in Ecuador or Colombia before coming to the United States, and they have to show that they couldn't get asylum in those third countries. So that's something that will apply to them. And particular social groups, so groups in the societies that are not treated well, such as members of the LGBTQ community. In some countries, even women could be a particular group because they are treated a certain way due to their gender. And also political opinion, which again, a lot of these folks that I've seen at least have actually had government jobs, especially in Venezuela, and they are fleeing as a result of persecution because they were opposing the rules or the orders that they were given. And so asylum is certainly one of them. It's a relief that needs to be filed within the first year of arrival, which creates many challenges for folks who do not even know about the deadline. And to make matters worse, not knowing about asylum and not having an attorney is not an exception to not meeting the 1-year deadline. And so that is a challenge. But if one files within the first year of arriving in the United States, you're supposed to have a hearing where you can develop your claim. And before that, although some people aren't getting this time, but if you file your asylum application 5 months after, you are eligible to apply for a work authorization. And like I said, a lot of the people who are in the dedicated dockets in immigration court don't even have time to apply for a work permit because their final hearings are scheduled even before the 5 months. And other forms of relief, unfortunately, develop through mistreatment that migrants have, and they are a very vulnerable population for many of the reasons that we've mentioned: lack of housing, language access. And unfortunately, they do end up in situations where they are abused. And I wanted to bring one incident that happened in May of this year, and it wasn't as publicized, but there was an asylum seeker going into 26 Federal Plaza to immigration court, and he wanted to file an asylum application. And a security guard and the immigration court took advantage of his perceived authority and told the asylum seeker that they were going to help them with an application. And turns out they just took them to a secret room and sexually abused them. And this is probably not the first time this happens. We have had actually a lot of complaints against the security guards at 26 Federal Plaza. And as awful as it is, there is relief that could come out of situations where migrants are abused and are tricked in this way. And so that could be non-immigrant status, or for victims of crimes, and anyone, actually they have to be undocumented to apply for a U visa. If they've cooperated with the authorities and are victims of qualifying crimes, then that's a way to apply for status that eventually makes folks eligible for lawful permanent resident status, eventually citizenship. That's unfortunately, I think, going to become available to a lot of migrants as they live in the city and get abused, not just by authority figures in this case, but also by employers. So there are processes through which the Department of Labor can actually issue certifications for U visas. And OSHA recently became a law enforcement agency that can investigate abuses at work, and through which, unfortunately, I think a lot of migrants are going to be in the situations where they are not paid what they deserve. And so that will be one of the options that could become available. And there's other things. So in the Labor Department, there's also deferred action that the Department of Homeland Security is offering for folks who have active investigations of work violations. And deferred action just means a decision by the Department of Homeland Security to not remove the person for a certain amount of time. And on top of that, that is also a category that qualifies people for employment authorization. So there's that. T visas, I would say, and for a lot of the young people, special immigrant juvenile status, which is a law for abused, abandoned, or otherwise children who can't reunify with parents. And it's okay, or they're still eligible for it if they come in with one parent, but the other parent either was abandoned them or they can't reunify. And that's going to be something that, unfortunately, we're seeing a lot, although a lot of families are coming with both parents. As Harold said, TPS, although temporary protected status, is only available for people who have been here from a specific amount of time, And so the most recent designations are for folks who have been here since 2022. So by definition, that's not going to work for a lot of the recent arrivals. But there are other things that the government could do to at least allow folks to have work permits. I heard the deputy mayor speak about their ask to make this happen, and there are ways that the government can do that. I mentioned deferred action. That is something that is entirely within the purview of the executive branch and particularly the Department of Homeland Security to grant. And through there, one can get a work permit without applying for asylum. There is also a way in which the government, the way that they are at the border, paroling folks to attend their immigration hearings, they could grant parole for not just 2 months, which is what they're doing now, but for 2 years. And that would also be an eligibility category for obtaining employment authorization documents. So these are very simple fixes that the government could do, but they are not doing. And again, these are things that I think will help a lot of migrants, but without the funding to access legal services, it's going to be a shame that a lot of these folks who could have had a path, access to a path to a citizenship or to a residence, lawful permanent residence, they're not going to be able to access, even though it is available to them.
Do we have any numbers on how many people who have come in the last year or so have been able to achieve work authorization or successfully file claims? Is there any data or any numbers out there about what we're seeing?
There are definitely numbers about the backlogs. I'm not sure about the grants, and these vary a lot by jurisdiction and also by venue, by venue, whether it's immigration court or the asylum office. The only numbers I know is that there are about 1.6 million pending asylum cases, and that's including the immigration court and the asylum offices across the country. In terms of success, I think the rates are going to be pretty low because of lack of access to legal representation. And in terms of work permits, I mean, a work permit is an application that, for the most part, depending on the category, is not discretionary. And so that's going to be something that folks are just going to be eligible to obtain for the most part. But asylum, I'm going to say that the rates are probably pretty low, like 1/3 probably or less, I think, if we're looking at the entire country. But they vary a lot by state and even immigration judges. It varies a lot by immigration judges.
I would just
Jeffrey, can I just mention, I'm sorry.
I was just going
Sorry,
to
Harold.
quickly add to that question of like, do we have a sense of how many people have maybe received work authorization? I totally agree with Stephanie. It's like probably very early on to have a clear, statistical sense. In our report, though, what we were able to find out is that based on the folks who self-reported and participated in the survey, close to 97% of those individuals reported not having received work authorization. And so we're looking, at a substantial amount of people who are, almost a year into this moment, right, have not been able, in all likelihood, to obtain work authorization and are already probably living, in some ways on the margins of society. So it's not the path that ideally they should be on if we want them to thrive in our communities.
Thank you guys for that. I want to go back to something that the Reverend touched on earlier, which was this sort of upset from some people who feel like, New York City has put out this $4 billion number, that a lot of resources are going to migrants when New York City has a fairly substantial population of people who are low income and need of services. Also, we already had a homelessness crisis going on here before migrants began arriving. I'm wondering, maybe, I would love for each of the panelists to maybe talk a little bit about what you're seeing in that respect, just this sort of sense that, some New Yorkers who are struggling may feel some resentment against migrants who are here, who are getting city resources. I know when the city placed people in schools, some of the protesters out there were, people you think might be in support of helping people in the situation. So I wonder if each panelist could just take a minute or two and address that.
Well, if I could say something real quick about this, I mean, the state has a long history of welcoming immigrants, right? And just in the last 3 adopted state budgets, there's been billions of dollars put in to help immigrants, right? This year alone in the state budget, the legal services for immigrants tripled from the usual 21 million to 63 $1 million. And that was just part of the money that's been spent in just 1 year. There was $1 billion to help New York City deal with the current situation. But in the past, it's also made New York State more welcoming by putting together a whole set of laws to protect immigrants, right? So we do have this history. New York is more and more a state of immigrants, but there is situations where immigrants who are here and have been here, legal or undocumented for a long time, feel that they're kind of being jumped over on the line for social economic progress. And we've seen that in other cities. We've seen it in Denver, we've seen it in Chicago, we've been seeing it in border towns all along Texas. And I come back to today's poll by Siena, which when we look at the data of the polling group, no matter what the income level or the socioeconomic status of the person being asked the question, they objected to the busing of migrants and using the SUNY system as a housing option. And to me, that was amazing. Usually folks, higher incomes over 100,000 would be more open to having New York become more welcoming. But it was the majority all across the board were opposed to seeing more resources.
I want to say that I think that that's a false narrative that sometimes is used for political purposes, but just looking at the reality is, what kinds of benefits they could even get. So shelter and food, I think that those are basic human rights that anyone should have access to. And it's not a matter of we were here before. There's no one that if someone needs that, the city is offering that. So they're not giving it to new arrivals and not to longtime New Yorkers. I don't think that that's happening. I think that the shelter system, again, the shelter housing crisis rather, is an issue that's been happening for a long time. And during this time, it's being exacerbated. But again, it's not that they are getting priority for shelters. They're just opening up more shelters because that's what's needed, but they're not taking out other people who were in shelters. So that's not what's happening. From a legal services perspective, we don't have funding. At least some of the funding has gone to nonprofits to do very limited services for the recent arrivals. And by and far, at least at Brooklyn Legal Services, we are still serving the clients that we've had from before. We don't have capacity to serve the new arrivals. And we do, instead of taking them for individual representation, we do things like know your rights workshops, pro se clinics, etc. And so we're not, no one's jumping the line. And the cases that are being adjudicated, at least in immigration court, they're just hiring a lot of immigration judges. So yes, it's true that cases for recent arrivals are moving a lot quicker. But because of the new migrants and the new hiring of immigration judges, even those cases that had been in a backlog are moving even a little quicker. So we were seeing individual hearings, final hearings being scheduled 3 years out, 4 years out in the past, and now maybe a year out, even with judges who have been working in the immigration courts for a while and have had huge caseloads. So I don't think that anyone's really jumping the line. And with respect to public benefits, up until recently, the migrants who are coming were not eligible for any public benefits. They're not eligible for Medicaid unless they have a PRUCOL or persons residing under color of law status, which means that they have some type of application with immigration pending or that the government knows that they are here residing. And so now those assistance programs like cash assistance and SNAP have been expanded to include others. But if they have no applications pending, they're not competing for any benefits because they're not eligible for them. So I think when you look at the facts, like it's a crisis for sure, but I don't think that resources are going to them rather than New Yorkers. And even in the school system, I've seen some schools accessing teachers because they don't actually have enough students. And with migrants coming in and their children going to schools, the schools have been able to get more funding to actually provide in those services. So in many ways, I think it helps, and migrants, the new and also undocumented folks who've been here for a while, they contribute to the economy by paying taxes. They could do so easier with a social security number, but they can do that still even with tax IDs. And so these are folks who are not going to get any benefit unless they find a way to get status, but they're still contributing to the economy. And so I do want to challenge that narrative. I think, like I mentioned before, that it is a lot of times fear-mongering, xenophobia, and just this fear of the other and recent arrivals. And but when you look at the facts, I don't think that that's what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I agree with Stephanie. I mean, but there's a gap in terms of public perception, right? So a quarter of the gross state product, which is $1.8 trillion, is contributed by immigrant labor. Undocumented immigrants in New York State alone pay several $billion in taxes every year. But this isn't like sexy news that is in headlines that any newspaper makes the news every night. So we're up against the images of masses crossing the southern border, and then arriving in New York and Washington, D.C. Without the full context, because the media fails to provide the full context of the story. So that's the challenge.
Reverend, did you want to add to your earlier remarks?
I think there is a great deal of misinformation. But let me begin. We have every Thursday at the church Advocacy legal clinic. We see just about close to 70 people every week. And then, we continue to do the follow-up. We don't have a lawyer with us. I mean, we have friends that know of the law. We have people who have, come out of the system of deportation system, the immigration staff who are working with us, who are training us. We have, alliances with, other community organizations that help us do the work. In all of that, I see a great, and it's great to challenge the narrative. I do believe in that. But also, I think we need to really go far, even further than that, because, what we are doing, it's, falling into kind of deceiving people when we welcome them and not give them the tools, to really begin this new life. I see this as a four-tone kind of rhetoric in terms of, on one hand, we are welcoming them, but on the other hand, we are just leaving them hanging because we don't give them. And we don't, finally, we do not believe in investing on the people. And history has taught us, that at the beginning, immigrants, recent immigrants, they drain, they utilize resources, but, it evens out as they grow and deepen the roots in the new land. So we have that, the narrative has to also include that. But at the same time, I think we need to challenge, this naive, deceptive rhetoric that, like just by opening the door to the room doesn't mean that we are doing all that we can do. Here in the Southwest Brooklyn region, the South Brooklyn Mutual Aid, and there are other groups, that are kind of shouldering, and doing a lot of the work that needs to be done. And we know that, Catholic Charities, other organizations are full capacity, but there are other ways to respond responsibly, to these legal needs. And I think we need to utilize that at this point. I do fear, though, that, and I do believe in the doing everything, hyper locally, and hopefully this will have a ripple effect, to the state and to the nation. But I do also, dare to challenge, that rhetoric that is kind of deceitful and really allows the federal government just to kind of wash their hands, with good people and with us that are doing the work that needs to be done. We need to have policies that really uphold and reflect, a humane and dignity of anybody, just anybody. I mean, if the crisis points out anything, is the lack of, faith in people, in terms of allowing people, to make of their lives self-determination, a new start. And I think we need to really recalibrate our policies and say, we are investing on people, and this is a worth investment, because sooner or later, as Guillermo said, it's not 2042 is not too far. I mean, a lot of the baby boomers and old, they are going to be relying for our, these immigrants that are arriving, kind of feeding those networks of assistance for the elderly, for those who are going to be retiring.
Thank you guys for addressing that. We're rounding out to our last question, and I want to leave time for Q&A from the audience. Maybe someone could just address really quickly, just looking forward, what do we have to look forward to? Are there any other initiatives, legislation going forward that are going to have a substantial effect on the influx of migrants and asylum seekers, and how the city and state is handling the situation? I don't know if maybe Guillermo wants to talk about that.
Yeah, thank you, Jeffrey. Yeah, I think we're all at the mercy of federal government, right? So the work authorization piece, even if it was fast tracked, you have the Administrative Procedures Act that has to be followed. So we're looking at 3 to 4 months before any rule to fast track work permits for the asylum seekers before it takes place, right? So even if the federal government issues a rule tomorrow, it would be going through the legal process that it has to go through. It would take at least 3 months because of public 90-day public notice and hearing and testimony. So we're all at the mercy of the federal government on doing something to really remedy the situation, because no matter how many resources, right? And I've worked the state government for a while, and again, I've seen billions of dollars targeted towards the immigrant community. But if we don't have an orderly kind of system that allows for their welcoming and helping them integrate into the community, like the Reverend mentioned, then we're just really leaving people up for more misery. Stephanie mentioned all the sexual abuse that's been happening to some of the asylum migrant seekers. Catholic Charities has been doing tons of work with unaccompanied minors. 80% of these children have had some kind of sexual assault experience. And at this point, we're between 2019 and 2022, we have seen 500,000 unaccompanied minors enter the United States. I think the federal government has to do something to end this business model of human traffickers within any reform that comes out. And I think because of the political system that we're in and so divided, so fragmented, I think it's going to be a hard road to follow.
Excellent. Great. Well, thank you, guys. Let's open it up for some questions. A couple of audience questions we have, I understand.
Great, thank you all, and thank you again, Jeff. We have two questions from Julia Preston of the Marshall Project. One is for Guillermo and one is for Reverend Ruiz. For Guillermo, what impact would it have on New York City if current asylum seekers could receive much faster work authorization?
Well, for sure, it takes them out of even legal jeopardy. And I think some of the lawyers could attest to this, because if they're desperate, they go to work in the black market. I think that affects some of their legal standing down the road to apply for legal status in the country. So, and as soon as they are given some kind of protection, so they don't prey victims to unscrupulous business owners or possible, like day labor situations, I think it would help tremendously.
Thank you. For Reverend Ruiz, if the asylum seekers received work authorization, would it deepen the resentment you described in the undocumented community? Do you support the call for faster work authorization for asylum seekers?
I think, it will be a show of that the government is doing something in many ways, to say the least. Seemingly there is this discontent, and we've been dealing with that. But I keep reminding those who have been in this country, living in the shadows, that, these recent waves of immigrants, brothers and sisters, remind us of the fight that we need to still fight, and the promise, that needs to be realized. I think it is a call for all of us to renew our efforts to have an immigration system that is, upholding and protecting the dignity of families and individuals. I deeply believe in that. I deeply believe that if something positive is down with this recent wave, those people who are resentful will see this as a sign of hope, as a sign that there is something being done, and sooner or later, opening the doors for others, those who have been here with the door shut. It's a hope, that they are seeing the door being open, even if they are not the ones that are entering that door, but there is a hope in terms of opening those doors.
That covers all of the questions that we have in the Q&A section. I will leave it up to you, Jeffrey, if there's any other questions you wanted to posit to the panelists. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, no, one question I wish I had a chance to, before the deputy mayor left. I definitely understand the city's point about this being a federal issue and there need to be federal solutions. But I think it's fair to critique the city on how they've handled the situation. One critique I've heard is that the city has been too much in sort of emergency management mode and hasn't yet shifted to sort of, this is going to be a long-term issue situation. And I'm wondering, I'm not trying to dump on the city or anything, but I'm just wondering, love to get you guys' thoughts on that. Has the city done a good job at sort of switching out of crisis mode into long-term management mode, and what can they do better to make that transition, if not?
Yeah, if I could say something watching from another part of the state, how it's being handled. You're absolutely right, Jeffrey. It's all in kind of crisis mode, but it looks like the impact that this is a long-term problem has to be addressed. You see that the city council, the public advocate, they have delegations go to Washington, but they don't come back with any concrete information on any success they've had in moving the issue forward. And I think that just complicates the issue. And the state government can only provide so much in terms of, I think, funding because of limitations within the budget, as other resources are being, there's need for other resources to go other directions. But, and we can't tax our way out of this problem, right? You can't build housing overnight. And a lot of the housing that is available in upstate communities that have been abandoned for years is really in no condition to even be rehabbed immediately. So it's a tough road.
We have actually two other questions in the chat. Just a few minutes left, so it's a big question, but I guess we're asking for brief answers to respect all of your time. Judith Bass says, my question is whether comprehensive immigration reform is at all possible.
Oh my gosh, yeah, I mean, that's ideally, right, what would need to happen, but that's again, I would feel like a longer term solution. But it's very hard to, I think it'll be a while before that happens, if it ever does.
I will just jump in really quickly because obviously it is like a long-term conversation, a long-term discussion. Really quickly though, I think when we talk about comprehensive immigration reform, I think we have to be very mindful of what we're discussing, right? Because for some folks, that means what we're seeing currently in Washington, right? There is a flurry of different bills that are being posited as solutions to our immigration situation, such that they would upend our asylum system as we know it, shut down the border, right? So like, there is energy from some corners of the country to do something about immigration and to comprehensively, quote unquote, fix it. It's just not necessarily the things that are going to actually help our immigrant communities. And so, you know, when we think about comprehensive immigration reform, we're thinking about, you know, undoing some of the harm that's been embedded in our immigration laws, this selection of one population over another, right? There is a bill out there that our members have long been really excited about. It focuses on a very small area of our immigration laws that's called registry, which would essentially create the ability for long-term residents to apply for lawful permanent residence, essentially simply based on the length of their time in the United States. This is a part of our immigration laws that goes back to the 1920s, which means that generations upon generations of folks have actually accessed this form of relief. But because it hasn't been updated and modernized, it's become obsolete to many in our community. So, you know, there's a bill out there that Senator Padilla from California has been a big advocate of, that would essentially just change and update a couple of numbers, you know, in our registry law within our immigration laws that would immediately open up the ability for so many in our communities to finally access lawful permanent residence. So that's, you know, when we're thinking about our North Star, when we're thinking about what needs to happen, it's that kind of reform that we really try to keep our eye on. And we have to believe that it's possible. It's absolutely necessary.
Okay, so with that, I think our panel is complete. Thank you all again for lending your time and your knowledge tonight. This has been a really important conversation, and I'm so glad to have been able to spend the time with all of you. So thank you. And thank you, Jeff, for doing an excellent job moderating. Have a great night.